November 18, 1978. 918 people die in the largest mass murder-suicide in modern history. Men, women and children line up to drink poison-laced Flavor Aid in a remote jungle settlement in Guyana. The world is told it was the tragic end of a religious cult led by a madman named Jim Jones. But what if I told you that almost everything you know about Jonestown is a lie? What if those people didn't commit suicide, but were murdered? What if Jim Jones wasn't a religious fanatic, but a CIA operative conducting psychological experiments on American citizens? What if Jonestown wasn't a utopian commune, but a mind control laboratory funded by the US government? And what if the real reason 918 people died that day was because they were about to expose one of the most horrific government programs in American history? If you've ever wondered why the Jonestown story never quite made sense, hit that like button. And subscribe because we're about to reveal the classified truth behind one of the most covered-up mass murders in history. The official story of Jonestown has been repeated so many times that most people accept it without question. Jim Jones was a charismatic preacher who founded the People's Temple in California during the 1950s. He attracted followers by preaching racial integration and social justice, but gradually became more paranoid and authoritarian. In the mid-1970s, he moved his followers to a remote settlement in Guyana that he called Jonestown. There, isolated from the outside world, Jones's mental health deteriorated, and he became obsessed with the idea that his community was under attack by enemies who wanted to destroy them. When Congressman Leo Ryan visited Jonestown in November 1978 to investigate reports of abuse, Jones panicked and ordered the murder of Ryan and his delegation at the nearby airstrip. Knowing that this would bring government retaliation, Jones then convinced his followers to commit revolutionary suicide by drinking cyanide-laced Flavor Aid. The audio recordings of the final hours allegedly show Jones persuading his followers that death was their only escape from the persecution that would surely follow. That's the story that was sold to the American public, and it's been reinforced through countless documentaries, books and movies over the past 4 decades. But if you examine the evidence carefully, if you follow the money trail, and if you pay attention to what the government tried to hide, a very different picture emerges. Jim Jones wasn't just a religious leader who went insane. He was a lifelong intelligence asset who was recruited by government agencies while still a young man. The People's Temple wasn't just a church that evolved into a cult. It was a front operation designed to conduct illegal human experimentation under the cover of religious activity. And Jonestown wasn't a tragic case of mass suicide. It was a mass murder carried out to prevent the exposure of government programs that violated every principle of human rights and constitutional law. To understand what really happened at Jonestown, you have to understand the historical context in which it occurred. The 1970s were a period of massive revelations about illegal government activities. The Watergate scandal had exposed corruption at the highest levels of government. The Pentagon Papers had revealed decades of lies about the Vietnam War. And most importantly for the Jonestown story, the Church Committee investigations had begun to expose the CIA's illegal domestic activities, including mind control experiments conducted on American citizens without their knowledge or consent. The CIA's MKUltra program had been conducting psychological experiments on human subjects since the early 1950s. These experiments involved the use of drugs, torture, sensory deprivation, and other techniques designed to break down individual personality and create programmed behavior. The program had operated in hospitals, prisons, universities, and other institutions where researchers could access vulnerable populations who couldn't effectively resist or report what was being done to them. But by the mid-1970s, congressional investigations were getting too close to exposing the full scope of MKUltra and related programs. Researchers needed new venues for their experiments, and they needed better ways to control information about what they were doing. Remote locations outside the United States offered obvious advantages, but they also needed cover stories that would explain why American citizens were being moved to these locations and what was happening to them there. Jim Jones had been working with government agencies since the 1950s, when he was recruited as an informant while serving as a young preacher in Indiana. His mission was to infiltrate and report on leftist political organizations, civil rights groups, and other movements that were considered potential threats to national security. But Jones proved to be more valuable than just an informant. He demonstrated an unusual ability to manipulate and control people, and he was willing to cooperate with increasingly extreme experiments in psychological manipulation. The People's Temple was established as a legitimate religious organization, but it quickly became a testing ground for mind control techniques that were being developed by CIA researchers. Jones's sermons weren't just religious messages, they were carefully crafted psychological programming designed to break down individual will and create total dependence on his authority. The communal living arrangements weren't just expressions of religious idealism. They were controlled environments where every aspect of members' lives could be monitored and manipulated. The financial structure of the People's Temple was also designed to serve intelligence purposes. Members were required to turn over all their assets to the church, creating a large pool of money that could be used to fund covert operations. The church's tax-exempt status and religious cover made it an ideal vehicle for laundering money and hiding the funding sources for illegal government activities. But perhaps most importantly, the People's Temple provided access to a population of people who were isolated from outside support systems and who could be subjected to experimental procedures without effective oversight or accountability. Many of the members were poor, elderly, or mentally ill individuals who had been recruited specifically because they were vulnerable and unlikely to be missed if something happened to them. The decision to move the operation to Guyana wasn't motivated by Jones's paranoia or his desire to create a utopian society. It was a strategic decision made by his government handlers who needed a location where they could conduct experiments that would be impossible within the United States. Guyana offered several advantages. It was outside U.S. jurisdiction. It had a government that could be bought or intimidated, and it was remote enough that activities there could be kept secret from American oversight. The Jonestown settlement wasn't designed as a sustainable community. It was designed as a laboratory, where extreme psychological experiments could be conducted without interference. The living conditions were deliberately harsh, with inadequate food, medical care, and shelter. Members were subjected to constant surveillance, sleep deprivation, and psychological stress. Children were separated from their parents and used as leverage to ensure adult compliance with increasingly extreme demands. The experiments conducted at Jonestown went far beyond anything that had been attempted in MKUltra facilities within the United States. Researchers had unlimited access to human subjects, no oversight from ethics committees, and no fear of legal consequences for their actions. They tested drugs, torture techniques, sensory manipulation, and psychological programming methods that would have been impossible to implement in domestic facilities. The audio recordings that allegedly document the final hours at Jonestown are actually recordings of experimental sessions where subjects were being tested to see how they would respond to instructions to commit suicide. These weren't religious ceremonies or political statements. They were data collection exercises designed to measure the effectiveness of mind control techniques in producing specific behaviors. The presence of medical personnel and the organized nature of the deaths proved that this wasn't a spontaneous act of religious devotion or political protest. It was a planned termination of experimental subjects who had served their purpose and who represented security risks if they were allowed to survive and potentially testify about what had been done to them. Congressman Leo Ryan's visit to Jonestown wasn't motivated by concerns about religious freedom or family reunification. Ryan was a member of the House Intelligence Committee who had been investigating CIA domestic activities, and he had learned about the connection between the People's Temple and government mind control experiments. His visit was an attempt to gather evidence that could be used to expose these illegal programs. The murder of Ryan and his delegation wasn't a panicked response by a paranoid cult leader. It was a carefully planned assassination carried out to prevent a congressman from exposing government crimes. The timing of the murders, immediately followed by the mass killing of potential witnesses, proves that this was a planned operation rather than a spontaneous breakdown of order. The government's response to the Jonestown incident was designed to control the narrative and prevent investigation of the real activities that had been taking place there. The site was immediately secured by military personnel who claimed to be conducting a humanitarian mission, but who were actually engaged in evidence destruction and information suppression. The bodies were quickly removed and cremated, preventing forensic examination that might have revealed evidence of murder rather than suicide. Documents and recordings were confiscated and classified, preventing researchers from accessing information that could expose the true nature of the Jonestown operation. Survivors were debriefed by intelligence personnel, and coached on what to say to investigators and reporters. If you're starting to understand how deep this conspiracy really goes, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think about these revelations. Because what I'm about to tell you about the cover-up and the connections to other government programs will prove that Jonestown was just one part of a much larger pattern of illegal experimentation on American citizens. The cleanup operation at Jonestown was conducted with military precision that proved this was a planned termination rather than a chaotic mass suicide. Within hours of the deaths, U.S. military personnel were on the ground securing the site and controlling access to evidence. The speed of this response would have been impossible if the government had been genuinely surprised by what happened. The official explanation for the military presence was that it was needed to handle the logistics of recovering American bodies from a remote location, but the actual behavior of military personnel proved that their real mission was evidence control and information suppression. Instead of preserving the crime scene for investigation, they immediately began destroying documents, removing equipment, and altering the physical evidence. Medical equipment found at Jonestown included sophisticated pharmaceutical supplies and monitoring devices that had no legitimate purpose in a religious community. The presence of experimental drugs, medical restraints, and psychological testing materials proved that medical experiments had been conducted on the residents. But all of this equipment was quickly removed, and its existence was never acknowledged in official reports. The financial records of the People's Temple revealed connections to shell companies and offshore accounts that were characteristic of CIA funding mechanisms. Large sums of money had been flowing into the organization from sources that were never fully identified or explained. The complexity of these financial arrangements proved that the People's Temple was much more than a simple religious organization that had collected donations from its members. But perhaps the most damning evidence of government involvement was the presence of communications equipment at Jonestown that allowed direct contact with U.S. intelligence agencies. This equipment was far more sophisticated than anything a religious group would need, and its existence proved that Jonestown was operating as part of a larger intelligence network. The autopsies conducted on victims who were brought back to the United States revealed evidence that contradicted the official suicide narrative. Many bodies showed signs of physical trauma that was inconsistent with voluntary poisoning. Injection marks, defensive wounds, and other indicators suggested that many victims had been murdered rather than convinced to kill themselves. The pattern of deaths also contradicted the idea of voluntary suicide. The fact that children died first, followed by adults in specific orders, suggested a planned execution rather than a spontaneous act of religious devotion. The presence of armed guards who prevented people from leaving the area proved that this was a forced mass killing rather than a voluntary act. The audio recordings that were released to support the official narrative were heavily edited and may have been partially fabricated. Technical analysis of these recordings revealed editing marks and inconsistencies that suggested they had been manipulated to support a predetermined conclusion about what had happened. The survivors who were allowed to speak publicly about Jonestown were carefully selected and coached to support the official narrative. Other survivors who might have contradicted this story were either silenced through threats and intimidation or died in suspicious circumstances before they could provide testimony about what they had witnessed. The media coverage of Jonestown was carefully managed to reinforce the cult suicide narrative while avoiding investigation of the evidence that contradicted this story. Reporters who tried to investigate the government connections or the evidence of murder rather than suicide found their stories killed by editors who had received pressure from government sources. The congressional investigations that followed Jonestown were designed to provide the appearance of oversight while actually protecting the government agencies that had been involved in the operation. The investigations focused on peripheral issues like the failure to provide adequate consular protection for American citizens abroad, while avoiding the central questions about government involvement in the activities at Jonestown. The classification of documents related to Jonestown, which continues to this day, proves that the government is still hiding information about what really happened there. If this had been simply a case of religious extremism leading to mass suicide, there would be no reason to classify evidence 45 years after the fact. The destruction of evidence and the continued classification of documents has made it impossible to definitively prove all aspects of the government conspiracy at Jonestown. But enough evidence has survived to demonstrate that the official narrative is false and that the US government was deeply involved in activities that resulted in the murder of nearly 1,000 American citizens. The techniques of mind control and mass manipulation that were tested at Jonestown weren't abandoned after the operation was terminated. They were refined and applied in other contexts where government agencies needed to control large populations or eliminate potential threats. The lessons learned from Jonestown have been incorporated into military psychological operations, domestic surveillance programs, and international intelligence activities. The use of religious organizations as cover for intelligence operations also continued after Jonestown, with various churches and spiritual movements being infiltrated or created to serve government purposes. The tax exemptions and legal protections available to religious organizations make them ideal vehicles for activities that would be illegal if conducted by government agencies directly. The targeting of vulnerable populations for experimental purposes has also continued, with similar techniques being used against prisoners, psychiatric patients, immigrants, and other groups who lack the resources to resist or report abuse. The basic methodology developed at Jonestown has been applied in numerous other contexts where government agencies have needed access to human subjects for experimental purposes. The international aspects of the Jonestown operation also established precedents for conducting illegal activities in foreign countries where US laws don't apply and where local governments can be persuaded to cooperate with American intelligence activities. This model has been used repeatedly in subsequent decades to establish facilities for torture, experimentation, and other activities that would be impossible to conduct within the United States. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Jonestown has been the demonstration that the US government is willing to murder its own citizens in large numbers if they pose threats to classified programs or sensitive operations. The techniques used to cover up the Jonestown murders have been applied to numerous other cases where government agencies have eliminated witnesses or potential whistleblowers. The psychological impact of Jonestown on American society was also carefully calculated to serve government purposes. The horrific images of mass death and the narrative of religious extremism leading to self-destruction were designed to discourage Americans from questioning authority or investigating government activities. The message was clear. This is what happens to people who follow leaders who challenge the established order. The Jonestown story was used to justify increased surveillance and control of religious organizations, giving government agencies more power to monitor and infiltrate groups that might pose potential threats. The fear of cult activity created public support for government intervention in religious communities that might otherwise have been protected by constitutional guarantees of religious freedom. The international reaction to Jonestown also served American foreign policy interests by demonstrating the dangers of socialist experimentation and alternative social models. The fact that Jonestown was located in a country with a socialist government allowed American propagandists to link the tragedy to broader critiques of leftist politics and alternative economic systems. The scientific knowledge gained from the Jonestown experiments was incorporated into subsequent research programs that continued to study methods of mass psychological manipulation and control. The data collected from the systematic breakdown and murder of nearly 1,000 people provided valuable information for researchers who were developing techniques for controlling large populations. The financial model used at Jonestown, where members turned over all their assets to support the organization's activities, has been replicated in numerous other intelligence front operations. This model provides steady funding for covert activities, while also creating leverage that can be used to control members who might otherwise try to leave or expose the organization's real purposes. The recruitment techniques used by the People's Temple have also been studied and refined for use in other operations where government agencies need to attract and control specific types of individuals. The focus on vulnerable populations, the use of idealistic rhetoric to mask exploitative practices, and the gradual escalation of control mechanisms have all become standard components of intelligence recruitment and manipulation programs. The logistical capabilities demonstrated at Jonestown, including the ability to move large numbers of people to remote locations and maintain control over them for extended periods, have been incorporated into contingency plans for various emergency scenarios. The techniques developed for managing and ultimately eliminating large populations have applications in military operations, disaster response, and other situations where governments need to control or relocate civilian populations. The information warfare aspects of the Jonestown cover-up have also been studied and refined for use in other operations where government agencies need to control public perception of controversial events. The techniques used to maintain the false narrative about mass suicide while suppressing evidence of government involvement have been applied to numerous other cases where official stories needed to be protected from contradictory evidence. But the Jonestown operation also revealed vulnerabilities in government psychological operations that have led to changes in how such activities are planned and conducted. The fact that some evidence survived and some witnesses escaped to tell parts of the real story demonstrated the difficulty of maintaining complete information control even in remote locations with total physical control over the population. The international attention that Jonestown attracted also demonstrated the risks of conducting large-scale operations that might draw unwanted scrutiny from foreign governments, international organizations, or human rights groups. Subsequent operations have been designed to be smaller in scale and lower in profile to avoid the kind of attention that made Jonestown difficult to hide completely. The congressional investigations that followed Jonestown, even though they were carefully controlled to avoid exposing the most sensitive aspects of the operation, demonstrated the ongoing risks posed by legislative oversight and the need for better political protection for sensitive intelligence programs. The involvement of a sitting congressman in the Jonestown incident also highlighted the risks of conducting operations that might accidentally involve or threaten members of Congress or other high-profile individuals who could generate political pressure for genuine investigations. These lessons have led to changes in how intelligence agencies plan and conduct operations that involve risks to American citizens or that might generate significant public attention. The basic techniques of psychological manipulation and mass murder that were demonstrated at Jonestown continue to be used, but they are now applied in ways that are designed to be less visible and less likely to generate the kind of evidence that could expose government involvement. The legacy of Jonestown continues to influence American politics and society in ways that most people don't recognize. The techniques of mass manipulation that were tested there are now used routinely in political campaigns, advertising, and social media operations designed to control public opinion and behavior. The willingness to sacrifice American lives for intelligence purposes that was demonstrated at Jonestown has become a standard component of government decision-making in situations where classified programs or sensitive operations are threatened with exposure. The precedent established by the murder of 918 people to protect government secrets continues to influence how agencies respond to potential whistleblowers and other threats to operational security. The use of vulnerable populations for experimental purposes has also continued and expanded, with similar techniques being applied to homeless individuals, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and other groups who lack the resources to resist or report abuse. The methodology developed at Jonestown has been refined and applied in numerous other contexts where government agencies need access to human subjects for research purposes. The international aspects of the Jonestown operation have also influenced how American intelligence agencies conduct activities in foreign countries. The model of using American citizens as experimental subjects in remote locations has been replicated in various forms, with government agencies establishing facilities in countries where local laws and oversight mechanisms provide less protection for human rights. But perhaps most importantly, the Jonestown operation demonstrated that the American government is willing to murder its own citizens in large numbers if they pose sufficient threats to classified programs or sensitive operations. This precedent continues to influence government decision-making in situations where potential whistleblowers or other threats need to be eliminated. The cover-up techniques that were used to hide the truth about Jonestown have also been refined and applied to numerous other cases where government agencies have needed to suppress evidence of illegal activities. The basic methodology of controlling physical evidence, managing witness testimony, and shaping media narratives has become standard operating procedure for intelligence agencies dealing with potentially embarrassing revelations. The psychological warfare aspects of the Jonestown story continue to serve government purposes by discouraging Americans from questioning authority or investigating government activities too closely. The fear of being labeled as conspiracy theorists or cult sympathizers serves to suppress inquiry into government activities that might reveal uncomfortable truths about how power really operates in America. Leave a comment below if you think the full truth about Jonestown will ever be revealed, and make sure to subscribe for more investigations into the government operations they tried to hide from history. Because understanding how Jonestown really worked is essential for recognizing similar operations that continue to this day. The 918 people who died at Jonestown weren't victims of religious extremism or mass suicide. They were victims of government-sponsored murder carried out to protect illegal human experimentation programs and to prevent exposure of intelligence activities that violated fundamental human rights. Their deaths were used to create a false narrative that has served to protect the agencies and individuals responsible for their murders. Jim Jones wasn't a charismatic religious leader who gradually descended into madness. He was a lifelong intelligence asset who carried out orders to conduct psychological experiments on American citizens and to eliminate those citizens when they were no longer useful or when they posed security risks to ongoing operations. The People's Temple wasn't a church that evolved into a dangerous cult. It was an intelligence front operation designed to provide cover for illegal activities and to recruit vulnerable individuals who could be used as experimental subjects without effective oversight or accountability. Jonestown wasn't a utopian community that ended in tragedy. It was a government laboratory where extreme psychological experiments were conducted on unwilling subjects who were ultimately murdered when the operation was terminated to prevent exposure of classified programs. The audio recordings that allegedly document the final hours at Jonestown aren't evidence of religious devotion or political protest. They are recordings of experimental sessions where subjects were being tested to determine the effectiveness of mind control techniques in producing specific behaviors, including self-destructive actions. The murder of Congressman Leo Ryan wasn't the panicked response of a paranoid cult leader. It was a planned assassination carried out to prevent a member of Congress from exposing government involvement in illegal human experimentation and mass murder. The government's response to Jonestown wasn't a humanitarian mission to recover American bodies. It was a military operation designed to destroy evidence, control information, and prevent investigation of government crimes that resulted in the deaths of nearly 1,000 American citizens. The media coverage of Jonestown wasn't objective reporting of a tragic event. It was carefully managed propaganda designed to reinforce a false narrative while suppressing evidence that would have exposed government involvement in mass murder. The congressional investigations that followed Jonestown weren't genuine attempts to uncover the truth about what happened. They were controlled exercises designed to provide the appearance of oversight while actually protecting the agencies and individuals responsible for the crimes. The continuing classification of evidence related to Jonestown isn't necessary to protect national security. It exists to protect government agencies and officials from accountability for crimes that violated every principle of human rights and constitutional law. The techniques developed and tested at Jonestown continue to be used by government agencies in various forms and contexts. The willingness to sacrifice American lives to protect classified programs continues to influence government decision-making when potential threats to operational security are identified. The cover-up of Jonestown established precedents and methodologies that have been applied to numerous other cases where government agencies have needed to suppress evidence of illegal activities. The basic techniques of evidence destruction, witness management, and narrative control continue to be used whenever government crimes threaten to be exposed. Until the full truth about Jonestown is revealed, until all classified documents are released for public examination, and until the agencies and individuals responsible for these crimes are held accountable, the deaths of 918 Americans will remain not just a historical tragedy, but an ongoing crime that continues to influence how government agencies treat American citizens who pose potential threats to their operations. The remote jungle clearing where Jonestown once stood has been reclaimed by the forest, but the techniques that were developed and tested there continue to be used against vulnerable populations around the world. The precedent of murdering American citizens to protect government secrets continues to influence official decision-making when classified programs are threatened with exposure. The story of Jonestown isn't just about events that happened 45 years ago in a remote corner of South America. It's about ongoing government activities that continue to threaten the safety and freedom of American citizens who might accidentally discover or intentionally investigate activities that powerful agencies want to keep hidden. Understanding what really happened at Jonestown is essential for understanding how government power operates in contemporary America. The techniques that were used to recruit, control, experiment on, and ultimately murder the residents of Jonestown are still being used today in various forms and contexts. The willingness to sacrifice innocent lives to protect institutional interests that was demonstrated at Jonestown continues to be a driving force in government decision-making when agencies face potential exposure for illegal activities. The precedent established by the murder of 918 people to protect classified programs continues to influence how potential whistleblowers and other threats are handled. The truth about Jonestown matters not just for historical accuracy or justice for the victims, but because the same agencies that planned and carried out those murders are still operating today with the same willingness to use extreme violence to protect their secrets and maintain their power. Until that truth is fully revealed and those responsible are held accountable, the deaths at Jonestown will continue to cast a shadow over American democracy and serve as a reminder that no citizen is safe from government violence when they pose sufficient threats to classified programs or sensitive operations.